Sometimes in your search for happiness, you ponder the meaning of your life.
And what is the truth?
You sift your memory for beginnings.
The truth.
You send your mind ahead for directions.
Truth.
But all you really know is now, and you are lost in the present.
And what is the truth?
Well, now, here's a man who wants to get right down to it. Kind of anxious to get to it, are you? Whatever.
Welcome back to the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. Once again, attempting to resurrect sense and meaning from the dust of a billion factoids. Last time we talked about the original philosopher, the first physiologist, meaning the first person to study, to rationally attempt to understand nature. And that was Thales of Miletus. We're going to continue that topic today as we talk about another member of the Milesian School, as it's called. Now, you'll see the Milesian School written some places and the Ionian School written others. But since Miletus was in Ionia, they're somewhat synonymous. There may be a few people in the Ionian School that are not counted among the Milesian School. Today we're going to be talking a little more about those philosophers from Miletus that are part of the Milesian School, which, by default, makes them part of the Ionian School. It's a little like the relationship between California cuisine and American cuisine. Obviously, Californian cuisine is part of American cuisine, but not all American cuisine is California cuisine. So the Milesian School is part of the Ionian School, but not every Ionian was part of the Milesian School. The Milesian School is significant because it's generally considered to be the first group of philosophers, the first school, if you will, of philosophy. And it consists of just three members, three people who hailed from the town of Miletus. There was Thales, today's topic, which is Anaximander, and then finally Anaximenes. Those three people make up the Milesian School. The Ionian School then included all those three Milesians, but you would also have to add a few other philosophers like Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, Archelaus, and some others. So today we're talking about, in essence, the world's second Western philosopher. That would be Anaximander. And before I talk about Anaximander, I want to go back to what I was saying about the very few wise things that human beings have ever said. Some of you weighed in with your ideas of what the wisest things ever said were. And for some reason, I don't know if this was tongue-in-cheek, but there were a few rock anthems in there. Things like, all you need is love. If you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. Can't always get what you want. And I have to admit, divorced from their pop origins, some of those lyrics do strike me as very wise sentiments. I'm not sure any of them rise to the level, though, of world historic wisdom. And I do have to say, what you consider wise depends on the paradigm that you're living within or coming from. Obviously, if you have a religious background and you believe that there is an ultimate reality that is divine, then the most wise thing in the world for you would be something that has to do with your relationship to that divine. I'm not going to get into all of the various wisdom statements from different traditions, things like love God, love your fellow men. Another was, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Or, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. So sentiments like that, obviously, if that's the paradigm you're working in, those are the most wise possible things you could say. I guess I should have qualified my wisdom quest by saying I'm not looking for something based in any particular conception of deity or any regional religious tradition. I'm looking for something that is universalizable as human wisdom. Call it secular if you will, but just a piece of human wisdom that all of us can relate to. Something that's part of the common human experience no matter where you're from or who you are. And in the last episode, I pointed out that Thales the Wise, the first philosopher, according to the Western tradition, is credited by ancient sources with coming up with one of the most wise things human beings have said. So wise, in fact, that it was inscribed on the oracle at Delphi, the temple of the oracle. And that was the deceptively simple injunction to know thyself. Now, you may rightly say that's not a wise statement, that's just somebody telling you what to do. But I prefer not to think of it as a command so much as just really sound, really good advice from a very wise old friend, in this case Thales. Because think what sound advice that is. It's probably the single best life hack ever created. So much goes into it, and yet so much potential arises out of it. Now, I'm going to leave it right there because this is starting to sound like a personal enrichment podcast, something I would never want to be accused of being. So, at the risk of turning Thales into the Milesian Dr. Phil, I'm going to say that it's wise advice nonetheless. And while we're on the topic of Thales and his wise statements, I'm going to point out one more statement that has been attributed to Thales. Something that is so quintessentially Greek, it's hard to believe that it originated anywhere. It just seems to be part of their culture, and that is, Thales is credited with saying, nothing too much. In other words, avoid extremes, moderation in all things. And this idea of moderation that was attributed originally to Thales was considered for centuries the single most important hallmark of wisdom. In fact, Aristotle went into a lengthy formal defense of that principle of moderation in all things. But rightly or wrongly, in its first instance, its first utterance, many ancient sources attribute that to Thales. Of course, as many people have pointed out, that cannot be an absolute maxim, moderation in all things, because it's self-refuting. But I won't go into that. We'll come back to the wisdom ideas later. But for now, two injunctions attributed to Thales possibly rise to the level of wisdom. Whether they are all-time world historic best things, most wise things ever said by human beings or not, remains to be seen. Now, before we begin our discussion of today's topic, Anaximander, let's review the Greek Dark Ages. Last time we covered the Greek Dark Ages and then the Archaic Age of ancient Greece. The Dark Ages were that period of low population, depopulation, poor living conditions, illiteracy, geographic isolation, not much trade going on at all, and social upheaval between the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, which happened to coincide with the broader collapse of the Late Bronze Age, which began around the end of the 12th century. The Dark Ages lasted until the Archaic Age began. Remember, the hallmark of the Archaic Age was increasing population, more material prosperity, better living conditions, more food, people organizing into large urban centers called polises. These polises were not only cities, they were states, they were entities unto themselves, and they ruled over some of these small outlying villages as well. They joined into leagues. One of the most important of these polises was Miletus, situated on the west coast of Asia Minor, what is now Turkey. It was ideally suited to be a trade center, receiving goods not only from the Mediterranean Sea, but from the Meander River. So Miletus in the Archaic Age was not only wealthy, it was a melting pot. It was a place where cultures and ideas came together from all across the Mediterranean. And into that rich and fertile soil, the father of Western philosophy himself, Thales the Great, Thales the Wise, was born. Now, one philosopher by himself is a philosopher. Three philosophers make a school. So Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes, all from Miletus, make up the Milesian School. And remember, we just talked about what that means. They were all from Miletus, so they were the Milesian School. But Miletus was part of the Ionian League, so they were also part of the Ionian School. Calling them the Milesian School is like calling Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Seattle Rockers. But they're also part of the West Coast rock scene, which included other bands besides just the Seattle bands. And so it is with our Milesian School of Philosophy. Now, these three Milesian philosophers did not just hail from the same polis, they were also preoccupied with some of the same questions. They all tried their hand at cosmology. Now, cosmology is the study of the origin and the makeup of the universe. So all three of them taught about the origin or the cosmogony, but they also talked about the current nature of the universe. And instead of arriving at a religious or spiritual makeup as the fundamental nature of the universe, all three of the members of the Milesian School were what are called material monists. Now, before you turn it off, I'll explain that. Material monism is the belief that all elements, all the material, if you will, in the universe, all the objects are composed ultimately of one element. Not only did they arise from one element, but in their fundamental makeup, they are still composed of that one element in some form or another. So it's monistic. It is one element. And maybe the best way to clarify what material monism is to contrast it with what it is not. Materialism is the belief that the ultimate reality of everything is matter and elements. You have to contrast that with spiritualism, which says the ultimate reality of everything is non-physical or spiritual, or idealism. Now, I'm not talking about idealism in the sense that you should live according to your highest ideals. I'm talking about cosmological idealism, which is that the ultimate reality of everything is an idea. In fact, Bishop George Berkeley, a famous British empiricist, said that the entire universe is just an idea in the mind of God. Plato himself, possibly the most influential philosopher ever. Plato's famous for teaching that the entire physical world, the world that we inhabit, that we interact with, that we see, is shadowy and illusory, and that the ultimate reality is ideas, which we call forms. So the physical world for Plato was not the ultimate reality. He was an idealist. But that wasn't the Milesian School. For them, the fundamental nature of reality was matter, was physical. So the Milesians were materialists. Now, we also said that they were monists. In other words, they were one-ists. They were not dualists or pluralists. A dualist, for example, divides the universe into two fundamental categories. And usually those categories are some version of matter and mind, or matter and spirit. And the key for a dualist is that these two separate categories are non-reducible. No matter how far you break them down or build them up, you can't get one from the other. You can't combine physical elements or matter enough or in any way to make a spirit, any more than you can squeeze enough oranges to make a Wednesday. They're categorically different, and never the twain shall meet. But that was not the Milesian School. They were not dualists, they were monists, and they were materialists. So for Thales, as we said, the fundamental substance was water. Water existed at the beginning, from water came everything, and to water everything could be reduced if we had the right recipe for breaking it down. And since water is material, not an idea or a spirit or a ghost, Thales was materialistic. And the two Milesians, the members of the Milesian School that came after Thales, were just the same. They were monist, they were materialistic. Let's talk about the next one in chronological order. That was Anaximander, or as he would have been called in his own time, Anaximandros. Now I have to confess, I always loved Anaximander, not because I agreed with or even knew any of his ideas. I just liked his name. Sounded like a king or a dinosaur or something. And so I always enjoyed the philosophy and the idiom and the persona of Heraclitus the most. Anaximander was my second favorite just because of his name. Anaximander was roughly a contemporary with Thales. He might have been his student, he might have been almost a co-equal, but most sources say that he was a student of Thales. Anaximander was born just 15 years after Thales, and he died around the same time. So while Thales was born in 625 BCE, Anaximander was born in 610 BCE. Both of them died around 546 BCE. Remember, Thales, almost 80 years old, possibly 80 years old, died of a heat stroke watching the 58th Olympiad. We don't know what took Anaximander off the board. But he wasn't quite as hardy, apparently, as Thales, because he only lived to be about 64 or 65 years old. And if Anaximander's most famous image is to be believed, he wasn't quite the physical specimen Thales was either. In fact, the most famous image of Anaximander is from Johannesstrasse near Trier of the witch-burning fame in Germany. There's an ancient Roman mosaic in which Anaximander resembles nothing so much as a pink, white-haired little old baby man. Now, of course, we have to assume that this is wildly inaccurate, not even based in reality, but that's what we have to go on, so we're going to go with it. And even if it is accurate, Anaximander more than made up for his relatively unimpressive physical specimenhood with a beautiful, powerful mind. And even if Thales is given credit as being the first philosopher by Aristotle, the written history of philosophy begins with Anaximander. Anaximander is the first philosopher who dared to compose an argued treatise of his ideas in a book that he called On Nature. That work is all but lost to us. We have one fragment from that text remaining. So the book On Nature is almost lost to us. But it was an influential work at its time. In fact, almost 300 years later, Aristotle had a copy of On Nature by Anaximander in the Lyceum. There was a copy in the library at Alexandria. And in the ruins of the very ancient library in the town of Taormina on the island of Sicily, a fragment of that ancient library's catalog can be found with Anaximander's name on it. So apparently Anaximander's work was kind of the early ancient version of an international bestseller. And as I said, only one fragment of that ancient work has come down to us, quoted by Simplicius in the 6th century AD. And in all the intervening centuries, people have been discussing and arguing over what Anaximander meant in the small preserved fragment of his writing. We'll come back to that. But first, what do we know about the life of Anaximander? Well, the answer there is not much. Precious little, I should say. It appears that Anaximander was very well traveled. He traveled extensively. which is of course entirely consistent with the idea that the Milesians were a seafaring, exploring people. Anaximander was no exception. We surmise that he was well-traveled by two known events, or at least well-attested episodes from the life of Anaximander. And the first of these events is Anaximander is credited in all ancient sources with drawing the first map of the ancient world. There were those who would draw regional or local maps, but Anaximander was the first to tackle the monumental feat of trying to draw a map of the entire known world, which in his days would have been the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and lands immediately adjacent to them. But still, monumental undertaking, and one which brought Anaximander fame and acclaim, and apparently made seafaring and exploring much more accessible to people of his time. So Anaximander, like many men of his time, was a polymath. He was a geographer and a cartographer. Another episode from his life that lets us know he traveled far and wide is that to Anaximander goes the credit for introducing the gnomon into Greece. Now, the gnomon is simply the vertical, upright, shadow-casting part of a sundial. Now, one proviso. We know that Anaximander did not invent the sundial or the gnomon. That was invented by the Babylonians, according to Herodotus. But somewhere in Anaximander's travels, possibly through Egypt, Anaximander came across the gnomon, realized its potential, and then did two things. Not only did he bring the gnomon to various Greek cities, one of the first that he set up was all the way over in Sparta, but he was also able, using his skill in geometry, his practical applications of geometric knowledge, he was able to set up sundials in such a way that they were accurate no matter which location they were in. So his skill in this regard was very highly prized. Now don't get me wrong, he wasn't the geometer that Thales was, but he had a practical knowledge of geometry, and to him goes the credit for introducing timekeeping in the form of the gnomon to the ancient Greek polises. And let me say just one final thing about Anaximander's travels. I guess this says more about his status among the Milesians than it does about his traveling, but Anaximander was chosen to be an oikiste. An oikiste was the founder of a new colony. Remember, the Milesians were precocious colony founders, founded hundreds of colonies, and Anaximander was chosen to be the leader of one of these colonies. This was a very difficult task. You had to be somebody who was trusted, who could lead others, who could solve very difficult problems. And Anaximander was chosen to found a colony called Apollonia on the shore of the Black Sea, a very important trading colony in what is now Bulgaria. So don't get it mixed up with all the other Apollonias in the ancient world. There must have been hundreds of them. This Apollonia was founded by Anaximander. So it's clear from what little we do know about Anaximander's life that he had a very full life. A life of civic duty, of exploration and travel. A life of invention, creativity, a life of writing. He achieved renown and respect in his own lifetime. But it's for none of those things that Anaximander is primarily remembered. No, his claim to fame comes from his contributions in three key disciplines, and it's in those disciplines that his legacy had the most influence. The first is astronomy. The second, proto-evolutionary biology. This one's a little out there, but we'll talk about it anyway. Finally, his contributions in philosophy. He's considered to be the father of metaphysics, something that, again, we will get to. It is in those three fields that he's had his most lasting and enduring legacy. So let's talk about first, astronomy. Anaximander was revolutionary as an astronomer. His work, On Nature, is the oldest prose document in the world about the universe and the origins of life. Because of this, he's often called the father of astronomy. And he had several innovations. Just listen to three of the main innovations that came from the fertile mind of Anaximander. He was the first to conceive of the Earth as being a three-dimensional round object. So that's one. He didn't think it was a sphere, unfortunately. He thought it was a cylinder. But still, a three-dimensional cylinder is a lot closer to an oval sphere than a flat expanse. So that was a bold, a brilliant innovation from Anaximander, one that brought us closer to understanding the cosmos. His next innovation about the universe was even more revolutionary. It's impossible for us to understand exactly how revolutionary it was, because now we simply take Anaximander's vision for granted. Before Anaximander, people conceived of the Earth as sitting on something, like maybe an enormous flat crust sitting on a cosmic sea, or a vast flat landmass, held up by pillars, the sky itself a giant dome overhead, hard and firm, held up by pillars of its own. That's why they would talk about the four corners of the Earth, or the pillars of heaven. Anaximander was revolutionary in that he was the first to see the Earth surrounded by a cosmic infinite. In other words, he invented the idea of space. The Earth, he said, is not covered by a firm dome. It doesn't sit on some other object. The Earth sits suspended in what he called the infinite and what we would call space. Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science, called this idea of Anaximander's, quote, one of the boldest, most revolutionary, and most portentous ideas in the whole history of human thinking, end quote. So this was groundbreaking, earth-shattering, paradigm-shifting work that came from Anaximander. And again, we all take his vision of the universe for granted now. And of course, you can point out areas in which Anaximander was wrong. He thought the Earth sat perfectly still in the midst of this infinite, perfectly balanced between all directions. So he did not conceive of a moving Earth. He believed the Earth was a cylinder, 3 times as big around as it was high. So he got a few things wrong. That's not the point. The point is this was a quantum leap forward in our understanding of the cosmos. He put images and ideas into people's heads that had never been there before. That's genius. He was also capable of following these ideas to their natural conclusions. Anaximander realized that if the Earth was floating suspended in the infinite, the sun and the other celestial bodies may not go from one side of the sky to the other and stop. They actually might continue around underneath the Earth where they can't be seen, travel in a giant circle, and then come up again the same place they were the previous morning. In other words, he was the first to conceive of an orbit of sorts. Now, he didn't get it right all the way. He thought the sun was a giant bright hula hoop covered by clouds. These clouds covered everywhere except where the light was shining at a particular time during the day. So he thought of a giant hula hoop with clouds moving around it, exposing the sun. He wasn't right about that. He wasn't right about the fact that the Earth stood still. He wasn't right about these circular orbits. They are elliptical orbits. But none of that changes the simple fact that he was revolutionary. And along with that, because of the model that Anaximander had conceived, he realized another very important corollary. That is that the sun and the stars and other celestial bodies had to be much farther away than they were usually thought to be. They also had to be much more massive. So think about all we owe to Anaximander. The Earth not resting on anything but floating in space. The idea that the stars and sun make their orbits around the Earth. The idea that the Earth itself is three-dimensional. It's not a flat expanse. The idea that the sun and stars are much more massive and much farther away than they had previously been thought to be. You look at all of these contributions from Anaximander just in one field, just in astronomy. There is no standard by which he does not have an impressive resume. These pre-Socratics were remarkable human beings. Anaximander actually posited many other ideas about the universe. I'll only mention one more. That is, according to Simplicius, a historian who wrote about 1,000 years after Anaximander, but might have had access to Anaximander's work on nature. According to this Simplicius of Cilicia, Anaximander already had speculated on the fact that there was a plurality of worlds, that worlds themselves came into existence and passed out of existence. So that's an idea that was well ahead of its time also. It would be taken up later by the atomists like Leucippus and Democritus, and by the Epicureans. But as far as we know, Anaximander might have been the first to speculate on the fact that this world, the world that he inhabited, wasn't the only world. That worlds came and went like so many other things. So in that, he was also ahead of his time. Now let's go to proto-evolutionary biology, another thing for which Anaximander is quite famous. Anaximander carried his speculations into the realms of the origins of life itself. And there are some who say that he was prescient, that he knew well ahead of the time anyone else knew, that human beings evolved from other creatures which actually came from the sea. Well, Anaximander did think that, sort of. But we are being way too generous to say that meant he understood evolution. Because here's what he thought. That human beings and fish and animals came from the waters. But according to his theory, animals sprang out of the sea a long time ago, trapped in a spiny bark. While they were in this spiny bark in the sea, it was moist and damp and kept them enclosed. When they came out onto dry land, that spiny bark started to dry up. Then it cracked open and out popped the animals. And human beings were slightly different. This is what Anaximander thought about human beings. According to the Roman writer Censorius, quote, Anaximander of Miletus considered that from warmed up water and earth emerged either fish or entirely fish-like animals. Inside these animals, men took form, and embryos were held prisoners until puberty. Only then, after the animals burst open, could men and women come out, now able to feed themselves. So you can tell right away that is maybe, if we're being generous, a proto-evolutionary theory. But nevertheless, there are many who credit Anaximander with at least thinking about how life might have developed and trying to come up with a rational mechanism, a natural instead of a supernatural explanation. Although to us it sounds a little supernatural. Let's move on now to what Anaximander is most famous for, at least in Intro to Philosophy courses. We talked about how the Milesian School was looking for a first cause, a fundamental nature of reality, and Thales found that in water. And we covered a few of the reasons for that. According to Thales, water could assume many forms. It could become a liquid, and when it was heated, it became what he described as air, which we would call steam. When it was cooled enough, it became ice. It could mix with dirt to form mud. Then when it dried, it became solid again. And not only that, it seemed that in the beginning, all was water, at least to Thales, that's what it seemed. So he found the arche, the first principle, or what has been described as the unifying source behind all diversity in water. Now, Anaximander, I'm sure, had a lot of respect for Thales. And out of that respect, I'm sure he said many nice things about water. But as far as making water the arche, the ultimate, the unifying principle behind all diversity, he just couldn't go there. And if Anaximander was truly a student of Thales, you can imagine that conversation. Thales is just ranting on about water. Anaximander's trying to appease him. Yeah, I love water. Totally feel you. Water is awesome. I'm all about the water, Thales. I really am. But what about this? Water and all of the other elements that we recognize, earth, air, and fire. All of these have properties that are a little counter to each other. So water is wet, air is dry, fire is hot, earth is cold, etc. So you can't have one of these four elements be the ultimate source of all the elements. You can't have one of the things be the source of all the things. If water was the arche, it would have long since overwhelmed air and fire and earth. So that's how Anaximander reasoned. Whatever explains all of the different things can't just be one of those different things. So you kind of see the difficulty Anaximander has before him. If it's not something, then what is it? Well, Anaximander had an answer for that. And his answer for the arche, for the source, was the apeiron. Now, apeiron is translated as limitless and boundless, because the Greek word para meant limit or boundary. So by putting the letter A in front of it, you negate it. Just like when you put the letter A in front of theist, you negate the theism and have an atheist. Well, this is the apeiron, the without limits, the without boundaries. Two key points about the apeiron. The Milesians were material monists. So the apeiron is one. It is one substance that gives rise to everything we see around us. So Anaximander's theory is monistic. It's also materialistic. This is the other thing about the apeiron. The apeiron is a substance, but it's one that can't directly be apprehended. It's one that lies beyond or transcendent to our common experience. That's why many historians consider Anaximander the father of metaphysics, because to the Greeks, the word meta simply meant beyond or transcendent to. So his apeiron transcends all the finite manifestations of it that we see around us in the universe. It is a transcendent physical explanation, so metaphysical. Anaximander argued that, unlike water, the apeiron could embrace all of the opposites you could find in nature. So for example, water could only be wet, it could never be dry, and yet the apeiron could give rise to wet and dry, to hot and cold. All of these various states, and all of the physical objects in the universe for that matter, Anaximander portrayed as the movement of the apeiron. Of course, not like movement from one place to another, but from one state to another. With that movement, he also explained the birth and death of everything. Everything which was born of the infinite, of the apeiron. And the death or cessation of those things was just returning to the apeiron. That, of course, was the underpinning for his idea that multiple worlds, infinite worlds, came into and went out of existence, because they all came from the infinite and they returned to the infinite, to the apeiron. The one surviving fragment, the one exact quote from Anaximander's writings that we have deals with exactly this balance between coming into being and going out of existence. And it's a very obscure quote. It is poetic language. In fact, the person who quotes him, Simplicius, says that Anaximander was writing with poetic language to explain this balance between coming into being and going out again. So I'm going to end with this quote. I'm not going to try to explain it because it's one of the most argued over, debated, and interpreted quotes in the history of philosophy. This is how it goes, though. Quote, "The source of the origin of things is also the source of their destruction, according to necessity. For they give to each other justice and payback for their injustice in conformity with the ordinance of time." End quote. What do I think he means? I think he means something coming into being creates an imbalance. It tips the scales one way or the other. And those scales can only be balanced. The injustice, as he describes it, can only be rectified when that thing that came into being goes back out of being. And that is deep enough and abstruse enough to end with. So I will end the episode there. Thank you for listening. This is the History of Being Human podcast. I'm the host, Noel Armstrong. Next time, to your great chagrin, we'll talk about the third philosopher, the third member of the Milesian School, Anaximenes.